All right, we live.
Yeah. Hey, Gaurang. Welcome to the webinar. How are you doing today?
I am very well, thank you. How are you?
Doing good. It's been a busy couple of weeks. So
Absolutely. It's I think the tech world likes to call it Techtober. So
yeah,
there's a but there's a bunch going on in our universe as well. How are you holding up?
it's good, man. It's good. Trying to still have a work-life balance.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's going on good. And listen, thanks a lot for taking time off for this. I really appreciate you doing this on a Monday.
No, always happy to chat with smart people. It's always good to kind of have in a little bit of a break and have conversations. So happy to be here.
That's nice. So I think before we get into speaking to you completely, I have a bunch of questions.
Yes.
I just like to talk to our listeners and give them a brief about how this webinar came about.
Yeah.
So let me just do that. Uh, so guys, when I started off in product marketing, there were hardly any resources out there on how to get into the role, and once you're in, how to be successful. Right? This was a few years ago, and fast forward, we're in 2020 now. It's still very hazy to how to get into the role, what it entails, and how to rise to the top. So to make sense of all of this, my friend Sudeep and I will be talking to accomplished leaders like Gaurang here to understand what it took for them to get into product marketing and how they are dealing with the situation. So Sudeep is not here for this webinar, but he'll be joining us for the later ones. And so these interviews will be packed with insights, with success and failure stories, hopefully, and we're going to keep it as candid as possible. So if you're somebody who's curious about product marketing, or want to get into the role, or if you're a product marketer and you want to succeed or rise up the ladder, this might be the webinar for you. So I think we're done with the introduction, Gaurang. We can start off. So can you give introduction about yourself to our listeners out there?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm Gaurang. I run what we call go-to-market strategy at Flock, and it's quite an interesting function which brings together all of the things that we really need to acquire, convert and delight our customers. And the function, the way that Flock works is that it's a continuous life cycle of sort of working with our customers. In the B2B SaaS space, there is no longer a universe of people buying or purchasing the product and then using it and that's it. You're not and it's just kind of far more of a ongoing relationship. And so that's my goal at the company, which is to make sure that all of our new customers are hearing about Flock. All of our existing customers are delighted with the experience that they're getting.
That sounds like a very interesting role. So how do you get into this? It seems like you got a designation which is very fancy. Let me say that. But a large chunk of it is product marketing. So how do you get into this role? And how do you figure out this was something that's your cup of tea?
Oh yeah, absolutely. The role. It's interesting you say that. So we really, I mean, a couple of years ago, 2.5 years ago at Flock, right? Like we started off really figuring out, um, you know, we had a product that was used by people at companies from 5 to 5,000 people. In many cases, far more even than that, right? And when you've got a product which is succeeding at a bunch of different levels, you've got to think about. What you're going to do, because every single opportunity is shiny. Every single customer wants you to build something fancy for them, right? And so the evolution of my role and the way I got into it was the following, which is that when I came to Flock, I think we were in a position where we had a very compelling product, and we had to think about sort of what our strategy is going to be and who our customer base is really going to be, or the ones, well, everybody's going to be our customer, but who are the ones that will help us sort of grow sustainably and essentially be somebody which can be a company which can ultimately be useful to even more people. So I started off when I joined the organization in what is traditionally called sales or marketing operations. And at that point in time, it was really us putting together nuts and bolts of figuring out what are the specific emotions that we need to run to sort of start speaking to our customers and converting them. And so there was a bunch of sort of sales operations. We were setting up a young sales team at the time, and in many ways it was also a learning experience for me, where I was really in the middle of things, literally figuring out, hey, this customer came from this, which salesperson should they be speaking to, how quickly are we talking to them, are we putting together the right structures for them, right? So I cut my teeth at Flock really figuring out what our customers were doing and how they were coming to us. That's where I got my start. Expanded from that into what we used to call, the middle of the funnel. In the old world of marketing, you still had funnels, as it were, and then so it was expanding backwards from sales operations into thinking about, okay, what are the things that we need to nurture our customers and so on and so forth. And so what that gave me was just like a very ground floor view, like literally, the 1 degree of separation away from the customer, where I could see what they were happy about, what they were upset about, what were the things that they cared about, and so on and so forth. And I think that, just to kind of round out the answer to that question, a lot of that gave me a lot of insight into where the value of the product is. I mean, a product like Flock, which is essentially used by companies to communicate internally, it can be very easy for you to say, hey, what's the value of the product? Oh, people can chat with each other. Right. And the only thing is that, yeah, well, there's 20 other products that let you do that also. And so then there is an inherent value of the product. And I feel like, to come back to sort of the area of product marketing, which you and your listeners obviously care very deeply about. That's where I felt like I started to kind of add value. Once I understood, hey, it turns out that there's 20 things in the product, but these are the things that our customers really care about. I feel like that's what helped me grow in kind of the organization, right? Because having your finger on the pulse of the customer is the surest path to move ahead.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I come from sales background as well, so I understand that for the requirements the sales teams have and the challenges they have. So you align yourself much better because you see things breaking really bad, and especially when you're not hitting those targets, right? So that makes sense. So how was the transition like? What were some of the difficulties that you faced? I'm sure it was a steep learning curve, right? How did that pan out?
Yeah, you're completely right. The transition was an interesting one. I think, of course, a lot of it is dependent on kind of the opportunities you get, and I can't complain. I mean, I've had kind of the most opportunities. I feel like, I was fortunate also in the sense that, these specific projects that came up, it's a question of kind of taking that opportunity. So I'll give you an example of what happened with us, which was that once we sort of started to build out sales ops, then we built out marketing ops, and I think it was a question of how do we communicate value to the customer quite, in the most effective manner. And so this project came along where we were like, we've got to build in a system where our sort of marketing folks, sales folks, etc., can go and speak to the customers where they are, which is in the product. In this kind of world, in this generation of marketing, you've got, what people like to refer to in fancy language as experiential marketing and so on and so forth. But it's nothing really beyond sort of the value of the product. The most powerful, effective way for somebody to start adopting and acquire, ultimately paying for your product is if they experience the value of it. And so we realized that we needed to find good, smart ways to do that. So this project came along where we basically put in basically an in-product marketing system, so a nurturing platform, etc. And you can take your pick. You've got app queues, and you've got intercom, and you've got 20 other platforms like this. And we were kind of evaluating them. So this project came down my sort of the pipe to me, and it was like, okay, Gaurang is going to go ahead and execute this project. So I went through this process of evaluating all of these different platforms, and then after that, once we kind of made our decision, it was also commercial negotiations, another important skill I learned while doing that. And then ultimately, when we had this platform on, and I was the one who had evaluated it. It turned out that I was the person at the company who was kind of best placed to really deploy it within our company. And so in the process of doing that, in the process of really figuring out, okay, it turns out that a user could be shown 20 different things. What are the smartest things to show them? That's really where I got my start in product marketing. That was the one project I got, and ultimately it was a lot of trial and error. It was a lot of first principles learning, but ultimately, yeah, I mean, I was fortunate to be allowed to make the mistakes I made, but ultimately figure out, okay, I can use this communicate the value of the product.
That makes a lot of sense. So I can see a certain path that you've taken, right? You were presented opportunities, you took them up and you delivered on that, and you learned and picked up skills as you went along.
Yeah.
Now, that's great advice for somebody is having these opportunities. Is
Hmm.
there anything else you'd like to add for somebody out there looking to transition into product marketing? It could be the different things they could do, if they don't have opportunities in their own company,
Mhm.
or it could be resources that they need to look at that might actually give them a direction to proceed.
Yeah, I mean, you're completely right, Shiva. It's not everybody kind of has those has the right opportunities. Either you're looking out to transition into a role in product marketing at a specific company, or within the organization that may be a function you are looking to move into. I mean, I think what we've done, and I can tell you this from experience, we now have a small team of product marketers within the organization. None of these folks were product marketers to begin with. And so what we found out that there's an opportunity when you have the right kind of skills, um, rather than I could have, for example, gone out and hired people, product marketing experts from all sorts of companies, right? Like there's people like yourself, people who are just stellar, who have stellar talent in this field. But I found kind of two things more so in product marketing than anything else, right? There is so many kind of different skills that come into this function. You've got on one hand, you've got to be very sharp, you've got to be very direct, you've got to be succinct, because you don't have you can't write a book. I mean, I think PMs like to say this, but if you're trying to solve a problem with copy, you're doing it wrong. Right but and so you've got to have all of those kind of what you call right brain skills, but then you also have to figure out funnels. You also have to know you have to be quantitatively sound. You have to ultimately know how to do A/B tests and measurement and statistical significance and all sorts of things. So I think product marketing is an interesting role, and those are if you feel, if one of your viewers is watching this and saying, hey, you know what, it turns out I actually do happen to have these skills. um, the advice that I would have, if you have an opportunity within your company, get your toe in the door. I mean, say, hey, I just want to see how this works. It's fine. No, that's the simplest way to do it. I don't want to contribute here, I don't want to get in the way. Can I just see some materials? And sometimes people will just share them. I just want to know how you guys built your onboarding tour. I don't think anybody within company culture is going to object to sharing something as innocuous as that,
Makes sense.
to a fellow colleague. So I feel like, being in the room where it happens, like sometimes that's a good way to get started. For somebody who's looking to move into this role, I feel like product marketer is a very hard role to get into directly, and at least from my experience, right? Because but having said that, you've there's plenty of opportunities. I mean, another one is what you call conversion marketing, or what you call middle of funnel marketing. I think that's an opportunity, and that, frankly, that was the function that transitioned into product marketing for us. So that's another way to get in. If you see an opportunity as what you call middle of funnel marketing, or nurturing, and so on and so forth, I feel like that's another good pathway to get into the function.
That makes sense. I think I like the part where you said, even if there are no opportunities, you can surely just ask the product marketing in your current company or about how they went about a certain project, and I think that's going to get your foot through the door, and hopefully you can build a relationship, and then when a role opens up, you can make the transition. So
Yeah.
one of the things that you mentioned is that you build a team internally instead of hiring from outside.
Mhm.
So how do you figure out if these people had the chops? Were there any particular skills that you're looking for?
Yeah.
And but you mentioned about the right brain and the left brain, creativity and logical thinking or critical thinking. Is
Yeah.
there anything in addition to you want to talk about how you went about building this team?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I had when I was looking at sort of building out this function, it was I mean, we have a relatively sizable marketing team now. We have about 11, 12 people. And we had to build a small function kind of within that, right? And I think the folks who ultimately we kind of end up pulling into this function. And by the way, the roles are kind of still, we like to we like to remain flexible. Like these folks ultimately also perform all sorts of functions as and when they are necessary. But I can tell you about two very interesting skill sets that I have on my product marketing team. One of them is kind of where I came from, which is that one person who was really good at account management, and working with existing customers. That individual also happened to be sort of quantitatively sound, had a certain sort of aptitude for branding. And so it was these like three very slight, I mean, they seem to very different skill sets, but ultimately, you know this individual is able to kind of say, oh, this is what the value of the product is. So if I have to build a 5-step onboarding tour, I can count on this person to say, hey, I spoke to these 10 customers, and they know, they've told me where the value is. right? So I don't have to kind of go. So there's that, the other person, for example, that we have on our team, again, very interestingly, came from, again, a middle of funnel nurturing sort of a background, had a really good sense of what is it that a user is looking for early in their life cycle. So we really care about sort of the early experience of a person using the product. um, and so, this person had done like years of writing emails and writing like nurturing copy and so on and so forth. And so I was like, if I've got kind of these two skill sets along with sort of the quantitative chops to get it done, nothing like it. And so our small but happy product marketing team is actually one person's a product manager, who kind of is a senior person in the function. And then you've got two these individuals who come from very disparate places, but I think they're helping us get things done.
Yeah, I've worked with some of them, and they're really great. So it's fun to work with as well.
Yeah.
But there's like another other point that I like to make for all the listeners out there, and you mentioned, because getting in product marketing is hard.
Hmm.
It's sort of a very cross collaborative role, and if things screw up, it's going to bomb pretty badly. So nobody really wants to take that risk, especially in India, which is like a culture where when you really want to make that transition, not many people are really willing to give you that chance. Like, I think if you're in a Western country, you're going to be much more easier to make any transition. But one of the things that I learned is that in case you're looking to transition, uh, so you should probably look at companies which are not the top tier companies. It's very hard to get into that, right? If you want to become product marketer for the first time, probably Google is not the right place to look at, because they are looking at experienced folks. So look at tier two companies, and you can just work with them for a couple of years. They might not have a big brand, but they might be more open to giving you that opportunity. So that's another insight that I have. But
Yeah.
Gaurang, thanks a lot for your inputs as well.
Yeah.
So moving on, and now this is a little more personal, right? Now, as part of your role at Flock, your
Yeah.
responsibilities are quite widespread, from acquisition to retention. Now, you work with sales, marketing, and product teams. So how do you ensure that you're successful with so much going on? Are there any frameworks that you use that you can share?
Yeah, I mean that's definitely a little. That's that's an interesting question. Because I do feel like it's not something that's easily acknowledged. I mean, certainly, especially as people who, for example, don't have that many years of experience in kind of being senior management. So I can tell you what I've happened to learn really over kind of the past year, like, which is that uh, I mean, this might be, I feel like this is probably something you'll read in Harvard Business Review and might sound a little bit borrowed, but I feel like it's a little bit, a bit about prioritization, right? And so to a certain extent, what I've built, I feel like are quote unquote trust centers, both in people as well as in kind of areas of the business. And so there's, by the way, there's never, if there is no area of focus for a leader, then I feel like that's a recipe for failure. So I can tell you, for example, personally, which is that I've got some very strong senior leaders doing marketing for us at Flock, right? And so I feel like I don't necessarily need to be part of every single final detail, because we've got a strong set of leaders there. And so there I focus far more on sort of outcomes and moving a high level number. And so as long as those numbers are kind of trending in the right directions, I obviously keep doing my dipstick checks. So I will always spend some of my afternoons just looking at random dashboards, looking at sort of what's happening in product marketing, what's happening in sort of middle of funnel, what's happening at the acquisition level. So I keep sort of myself informed, but not necessarily, going and talking to every team member and being like, hey, are you getting this done? On the other hand, I feel like there's definitely functions where I spend a lot more time, not just kind of doing the work, but really mentoring people also. So, for example, sales happens to be an area which I spend a lot more time for a couple of reasons. We don't have as much as deep, for example, a set of experience on the sales side, because we are still in many cases iterating before we kind of expand this function to a large extent. So I think it's just coming, just to kind of summarize. There's two things here, which is one is have an area which you do the work in, right, and where you're really deeply involved. And so some of my customers are often surprised, but I get on calls and demos, etc., with my salespeople all the time myself. I mean, it's It's good to be able to, if you're hearing stuff firsthand from the customer, that I feel like there's nothing more impactful than that for kind of a GTM leader. But having said that, keep your eye on the pulse, right? Like you've got to trust some systems, you've got to trust some people, and as long as kind of you've got a good tripod there, I feel like you're in a good place.
So it makes sense. So I think trust is one. Second is you got to do some of the work yourself, and prioritization. So these are the three frameworks that you use. Makes sense. I think it's back to basics advice, and I think it works all the time.
Yeah,
Uh,
I mean, and of course, I don't want to discount sort of the efficacy of the right frameworks as well. I mean, at Flock, we, for example, use the OKR framework. It's impactful in terms of us always sort of having our eye on the right kind of goals. And it's the other thing I also want to keep pointing out, right? Which is that sometimes you have OKRs, you're working towards OKRs. It's always good to also continue to question the OKRs, right? Because at the very so because ultimately OKRs are based on assumptions. So as far as because you asked about frameworks, I do also kind of want to call those out, which is that those frameworks, those tools, aid and assist in the process as well.
Makes sense. So one of the things that you mentioned is that you look at dashboards quite often.
Mm-hmm.
So are there any? You've got a lot of data sets, right? You've got the whole funnel, or it's a flywheel now.
I
So
will now.
you've got acquisition, you've got retention, you've got monetization.
Mhm.
So where do you normally hunt for good insights? Uh, and is there any combination that you use? Uh, is it what I'm trying to ask is there like again there'll be a bunch of other product marketers who are doing uh, self-serve SaaS marketing, right?
Yeah.
So if they are looking at the whole funnel,
Mhm.
could there be a combination that will give them good insights? That's the whole question here.
Yeah, I mean, product marketing is a big sort of part. Like I can specifically talk about some of the things that we focused on in our in product experience, right? I mean, for example, I feel like with sort of the wealth of options out there, everything that I've seen, there's this notion of what you call time to value, and I've done a bunch of kind of this. I've come kind of to some of these conclusions after reading a good bit, talking to our customers, and so on and so forth. And what you've got is a set of very interesting customers in today's world, right? You've got users particularly who in many ways I kind of question some of these assumptions which I used to have before. Many users do their research, right? Like even before they've come landed on your website, even before they've looked you up on the app store, they've googled you, they've said reviews, they've said comparison, they've looked at comparison sites and so on and so forth. And so you've got to have all kind of the right information out there. You've got the right information, for example, on what you call, what I like to call, I mean, this is something that we're kind of focusing on optimizing for, right? But the first 10 minutes in your product, I feel like are often some of the most important. So we have a bunch of data which really speaks to this part, which is the user getting the right information when they're seeing the first asset. So the first asset that they might see is your website or a landing page or your app, right? So are they getting the right kind of information? Then for example, you've obviously got the onboarding experience, the first run experience, all of that. So I look at a bunch of stuff which is in that, which kind of helps us diagnose. And it's, you'll find some very interesting patterns, particularly when you break it down by its sources, or things that you hadn't imagined. I mean, for example, we see some really interesting trends which vary by geography, on the same, like at least it wasn't intuitive to me, which is that why would users behave or interact with your onboarding experience or first run experiences differently in India or in the US?
Yeah.
But turns out there's some very interesting. So there's all sorts of but because you brought up self-serve SaaS marketing, I mean, I feel like this is definitely an important part to think about. And I feel like not just us, the companies out there which are optimizing for some of these or helping you optimize, your mix panels or amplitudes or all of these products. They also care a little bit about this. I mean, recently I read about this, for example, this notion of what you call core events. What are the top 10 actions that the user should be taking in kind of the
Before
first,
it's the aha moment.
right? Well, the aha moments, as it were. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we're obviously, I from a product marketing perspective, I love to kind of look at these metrics, see what's going on there. And I think if you're able to convey value early on, right? Like it's about making good first impressions ultimately. And the last thing I just want to add is that, because we're talking about product marketing, and one learning that I've had far more recently is sometimes, you can't push people into making decisions. You can't, we marketers like to say, oh, nudge the user to do XYZ. The users like to do what they like to do, right? Like, they don't like to be pushed in different directions. And so, again, the last thing that I've seen, and we measure this as well, is that if you put the right hooks in the right places, don't push the user to do it. How often do they proactively interact with that hook?
Got it.
So
Okay.
that's another one that we've kind of seen.
Makes sense. I think we went from the dashboard question into self-serve marketing. So I have a bunch of questions there, right? So, so, so that because you joined Flock when it was still young, for lack of a better term, and you were there when they set up the whole self-serve. One of the things that I just liked about what you just said is you can only nudge that much, right? You cannot really coax them into doing anything more than what they don't want to do. So,
Yeah, yeah.
so is there anything that you'd like to say? Any insights that you had from taking Flock self-serve that people out there could replicate? It could be just not just a product marketer, but it could be a startup founder who's trying to figure this out for himself and build a self-serve tool. So, is there any advice and insights that you might have?
I mean, I think, there's I, again, this may not necessarily be kind of unique, right? But I've also found that sometimes doing things that don't scale and measuring things more qualitatively than quantitatively sometimes has led to outcomes, strangely enough, which are which are more impactful and more powerful than optimizing for a trend I see in the data. Right, and like I've it's just been one of those kind of strange experiences. I mean, I'll give you an example with what we had, right? Like, which is that for a longest period of time, we used to say, oh, we're seeing great third week, fourth week, sixth week retention in the product, right? And we said, okay, how about, like, it's where it's at, it's as optimal as it can be, it meets or exceeds the industry standard, and so on and so forth. And uh, and we, for a long period of time, we worked off of that. And it turns out that, we once we started literally surveying our users, we've found out about all sorts of things which not only ultimately improved retention, but has kind of led to a far more, significant increase in how delighted our users are, right? So we measure NPS, we measure all sorts of metrics which impact your users. So I think sometimes, the people know this, but I feel like the value of it is understated, which is, if you've got a bunch of quantitative metrics and they all are pointing in the right direction, that's fantastic. But just call up a user and ask them, and then see how they're doing.
Got it. Okay. And is there anything else that you'd like to get? Anything tactical about how you went about onboarding your users? Any learnings from that? Or it could also be the way you would measure the whole onboarding process, right? Like you, I know that you and I have been working on some onboarding
Yeah,
projects.
yeah, yeah.
So without giving out too much confidential information here, but
Mhm.
we are still setting it up at my end.
Yeah,
At your end, you set it up. It's in a much more matured state.
yeah.
Uh, how do you go about figuring out this is working or not? And the reason I ask this question is because I feel like I catch myself doing this.
Mhm.
So this is what, so let's say you're working on a project, right? uh, the, and you go online and you read about how other people have done it, and when you read these things, they're so sophisticated, and
Mhm.
sometimes you tend to make it sophisticated just because you need to look like you're at the cutting edge of it, but sometimes it just doesn't matter, right?
Yeah.
So any insights on that? Anything, any learnings from that that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I mean, I can share. I mean, candidly, I don't know necessarily if I can kind of distill it into knowledge that might be useful for a bunch of people. I can tell you maybe one thing that worked. Or well, I mean, when I say worked, it means, again, it's very very dangerous to say, oh, this worked, because you don't know what effects you caused, right? So that's the one thing, maybe one learning I had, which is that when you say, oh, this worked, and by saying worked, you could be talking about a completion rate, you could be talking about, I feel like, the kinds of things about, and many of our viewers will also, uh, but when you say something worked, it's kind of worth almost writing down risks and rewards, and really going through them one by one by one. But the other one which I found interesting, which worked, so to speak, for us, was what sometimes we call it adding good friction. um, for example, we Flock is a very simple application to use, but it's got lots of controls that are visible right there in front of you. And to a new user, sometimes it may be, like, oh my god, what are all these controls, and what do they do? And so what we did was that, we said, you know what, actually, we're gonna make you go through a couple of steps of the store, right? And you can't skip them. And many users will say, oh, like, I don't want to see this tour, right? Like, I know what I'm doing. But then we went and did a bunch of our persona analysis, and turns out our most, like, valuable customers are the people who are not that tech savvy. They're very senior decision makers. They don't have time to figure it out all by themselves. And so it turned out that, even if, for the tech geeks who had to click twice on two steps to proceed, while we annoyed them a little bit and gave them a little bit of friction, it turns out that the people who want to figure out this product for a company, they don't have all the time to go and look through the support site. They found it super valuable. So suddenly, adding good friction, ultimately had a net positive return for us.
That's a really good insight. I think the earlier one that you mentioned as well, right? I have another anecdote. So in my previous organizations, so we were having trouble. So what we found out is that if once the people sign up for a free trial, and then they schedule a meeting with the sales guy, the chance of conversion go up by 3 or 4x.
Yeah.
So my goal as a product marketer was to ensure that everybody who signs up, I don't care if they use the product or not, because that did not, uh, because there are a very small percentage of users who figured out the product on their own.
Right.
So it was always preferred to route it via sales rep.
Right.
And they were having trouble getting these appointments, right? So I went in, I obviously redid the whole email campaigns, and it did not give such a big increase. It was a very marginal increase.
Right.
And then what I did is I realized that we can put a calendar in the product just when they're onboarded.
Yeah.
So we put a calendar saying that, hey, you signed up for the product. If you want a demo, schedule a demo.
Right.
And you can skip it as well. And guess what? All of a sudden, our sales reps started seeing bookings, like record bookings, okay?
Yeah.
And everybody's like, Shiva, you're like, oh, you're so good, you figured this out.
Yeah.
And then later we realized that a large part of the meetings are being cancelled.
Yeah.
That, after having put a skip button, after having put that, you can actually skip this step, and this takes time off of your calendar, and this is a
Uh-huh.
one-on-one meeting.
Mm.
I think people still went ahead and scheduled meetings only to cancel it later. So
Yeah.
that's one thing that I want to share,
Yeah. Yeah. Have had the same experience, but where, it's good to kind of share. And I mean, that's how we figure it out, right? Like, so
yeah,
yeah, I mean, um, really interesting experience there.
yeah. And okay, so moving on, right? If you I know we're running short of time, so I'll just hurry this up. So you oversee quite a few functions. I'm pretty sure that you work with SEO folks, and then the next day with performance marketers. And the rate at which things are changing, it's really hard to stay updated, right? So
Mhm.
how do you ensure that you stay updated, uh, just enough to lead the team,
Right.
and ensure that you're guiding them in the right direction, but not getting too detailed into the details, right? So how do you strike that balance?
Yeah, it's definitely. I mean, when you've got smart folks on your team, it's definitely an interesting challenge where, they're like, boss, we know this is gonna work, right? And you've got to independently basically use a certain amount of, obviously, domain knowledge, but also on top of that, just a certain degree of first principles thinking, to kind of, to make a determination as to whether something's going to be impactful. I mean, my performance marketers might say, "Hey, we've got this killer campaign set up, and it's only going to cost $10,000, and and we've got to go ahead and invest in it, right?" And so I feel like, this is where some of the anchoring, some of knowing your persona, knowing your customer, again, kind of comes into play. So, at the very minimum, we certainly do a certain amount of a certain amount of qualitative, qualitative filtering, qualitative measuring, right? Like to a certain degree, we make sure we do that. But at the same time, we also like we measure the funnel. We say, hey, you're projecting we will get 1,000 leads from this campaign, of which you will convert 50 into meetings, and then those 50s will convert at a certain rate, so on and so forth. So you've got all of that. But yeah, I mean, I think knowing your customer, and just having that background ultimately, because the fact of the matter is most decisions aren't, are data informed, but you can't have a decision made by data independently. Right, like
Makes sense.
data is never going to tell you the final answer.
Yeah.
It's going to be a human pushing the button. So I feel like, and to answer your question about just kind of staying abreast of what's going on and so on and so forth, I mean, there's just some fantastic podcasts out there, content that you're putting out right here. It's a little bit meta. So there's a bunch of content out there. We don't always have time to consume all of it. But I mean, that's where it just helps to follow good product people and salespeople on Twitter. You're scrolling through Twitter, you will get
Yeah.
knowledge. It's always. I mean, if you have the right people you follow in LinkedIn, it's okay. You scroll through, you gather some stuff. There's a bunch of very interesting communities. I mean, on a bunch of these, on Discord and so on and so forth. So if you're part of those communities, sometimes you'll just see something interesting scrolling through. And yeah, I mean, follow content from creators like yourself, Shiva, and I feel like
God,
I
okay.
feel like this is a good way to. I mean, I'm certainly learning a good bit, and hopefully, your viewers are getting some value out of this.
Makes sense. Thanks a lot for that. I think knowing your customer is something that stood out to me, because as product marketers, that's the main strength that we have, right?
Yeah,
Uh, I think staying abreast with everything that's happening across all marketing channels is practically or humanly impossible,
yeah,
right? Google, like, I don't know, changes its algorithms every fortnight, it seems. So it's impossible to go toe to toe with an SEO expert on that. But if you know your customer, then you'll know what copy works, and you'll know if the right if what channel works, right? Cool. So as you're winding down, just a couple of questions about Flock.
yeah,
uh, as you said, it's a pretty competitive space, right? I'm sure you get compared to another person or another competitor that sounds just like Flock,
yeah.
and Chanty, and and a bunch of other tools, right? So
Mhm.
how do you differentiate yourself, and how does the GTM look?
Yeah, that's. I mean, that is Shiva. I mean, a question I've had a lot of time to think about. Right? Why does somebody choose Flock over, literally take your pick. And there's all sorts of platforms out there. I mean, there's open source platforms, there's free platforms. And ultimately, yet there are customers who go and pay the $4.50 a user for Flock. And it took us a while, I mean, a good while to kind of figure it out, right? No, and not to say that we've got it figured out. In the world is changing kind of under our feet. I mean, we've got the pandemic, which has kind of again changed the market entirely. But I feel like, what I can share around sort of our go to market and what we found valuable is that, on one hand, you've got all of these tools, which are tools. Somebody, between you and I, like if we had a small 5 people startup, we could pick a tool and go with it, and we would use it 99% of the time, it would be completely fine. Um, but suddenly, let me put you in the shoes of a CIO who's part of a 2,000 person corporate group. It's a listed company with a lot of very sensitive information. Uh, and this person is now suddenly tasked with getting all of their employees online. Everybody works remotely. Some of them work in rural areas. And they are now getting all of this confidential information and sharing it on informal messaging systems, unsecure systems, and so on and so forth, right? And to that person, not only is it important that they secure the data, I mean, and use VPNs or this and that or whatever, right? But the ultimately the end state, the job to be done is to be able to have everybody communicate securely in a way which kind of makes sense for the organization, and they have that partner. So we say this is a little bit salesy. It's my salesperson's hat on, right? But I mean, I think with Flock, what we found works is that we are we have, the tool is just one part of what you get with Flock. Like the platform is ultimately it, but ultimately, the job which we solve for, and the reason that people choose us, uh, is that we we solve the problem for them rather than giving them a tool. And so it's very simple that, when we are consult, like a big part of what we do is basically we consult with these organizations and say, hey, these are the 10 things that you should do. And so we will bring everybody onto this platform, and everybody will be able to speak to each other. But on top of that, what we'll do is your organization gets mapped one is to one onto Flock, right? So it's not you thinking about your context and saying, oh, I have a department, and then what is the equivalent of that on Flock. It's us making the jump invisible. And so, for example, you instinctively know, oh, this is my department channel on Flock. Or, you look at a contact card and you say, oh, I know this person's title and their designation and their phone number, and I know I can reach them. So that's our go to market. It's just really, it's doing things in many ways that don't scale, doing things that are very expensive to do, which is having people which build solutions around the collaboration piece. But that's what we found works for us.
That makes sense. And if I'm not wrong, you guys are, like, I was reading your bio as well, and then you sort of spearheaded the expansion in India and the US in the
Mhm.
enterprise sector.
Yeah.
So how's that going? Like, enterprise deals are not easy to crack, especially for something like a communication tool. I'm
Mhm.
pretty sure that they have one of these Microsoft tools, or if they're a Google shop, they might have their own one, or sometimes they have Cisco Jabber. I remember when I started off in my career.
That's right.
It's quite a big. It's not easy to take off the other tool and then replace it. So how has that experience been?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you've you've got this notion of what is called shadow IT, right? And um and a lot of times, some of the tools that you talked about, we see it's so interesting that people have these platforms and they're like, by the way, we think we need Flock. And like sometimes, I mean, even I just outright ask them, I'm like, you have this platform, like, why don't you just use that? And sometimes the answer is what I kind of alluded to earlier. So I think, when you're the big difference when in enterprise, and this is not something we've known forever, we've learned this over kind of the past year or so, is that enterprises, like, in their evaluation process, your software or your tool is almost a smaller subset of things. How responsive you are, how smart you are, how well you understand their context, that's what helps you close, or or get to a point where you're adding value. And frankly, you have to add value before they choose to pay you, right? So even before the first dollar has been, the first contract has been signed, they would have already kind of received so much value from you then that you become the logical choice. And that's what we've seen. There are competitors, in this space, some of which you alluded to, right? And people evaluated all of them,
Yeah,
and ultimately went with us, even though we weren't necessarily the cheapest solution.
got it. Okay, that makes sense. Cool. So I think the last question here.
Yeah,
Now, if you were to go back with a time machine and you're starting off your career right now,
yeah.
I know you had a stint in journalism, which I am probably the only marketer in the world I've seen, or a product marketer in the world I've seen with a journalism background. I haven't met that many. I haven't met any actually. So what will you tell yourself?
Now, I don't know if you want me to kind of answer that philosophically or from sort of a more of a career perspective. Um, but I feel like there'd be two things I would say. I mean, I felt like I was told this, uh, by other people. So I also feel like, to a certain extent, maybe I feel that myself. Um, and you alluded to my background and my experience in journalism. So let me address that, right? Which is that, there were times when I was doing news reporting, and I was, I used to, so I used to cover basically India's economic policies, and so on and so forth. And I aspired ultimately, to sort of go into business, to figure out sort of how this space works, right? How ultimately, great products are made and sold and distributed, and so on and so forth. And before that, I used to actually, I used to be an engineer, right? And so it's this very interesting circuitous journey that I've taken. But I found that elements from every single one of those experiences have ended up kind of being so useful now. I mean, for example, I speak to the media now, and I represent Flog, and sometimes, you know, my experience in that space is very useful when I know how to answer a certain question when it's posed a certain way, or when I'm happy, when I'm kind of speaking to my engineers, right? And I was deploying the product marketing platform, and I was like, hey, this is how it has to be spec'd, and this is the data points, and this is when the data should flow from point A to point B. Turns out, having been an engineer and having trained in that turned out to be super useful. So yeah, if I had to go back and tell my significantly younger self something, I would say, don't think of what you're doing right now as useless, because I mean, that, especially when you're young, you can tend to be like, oh my god, I'm wasting my time doing what I'm doing. And that is, I mean, I'm somebody who's now leading go to market, used to be in journalism. Somebody might say, hey, was that like a complete waste of time? Go back and tell so if you're in that space right now, if one of your viewers is like, oh my God, what I'm doing with myself right now has no value, that, you could not be further from the truth. So that's what I would tell myself.
That's really good advice. Cool. I think this wraps it up, Gaurang. I think thanks a lot for your time today.
Yeah,
Right.
no, absolutely, Shiva. It's an absolute pleasure. You certainly, your questions made me think quite a bit. And I hope, I hope I added some value.
Sure. Thank you. I'll see you around then.
I will see
Bye.
you soon.
Take
Bye.
care. Yeah.